Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 1013 for July 16th, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
It's been a complex and complicated process, but I am delighted that we're coming to the end of it now and the visitors are going to be able to experience it.
The Scotch Whisky Experience at the top of Edinburgh's Royal Mile celebrates its 35th anniversary this year and marks the occasion this week with the opening of a new tour highlighting the production of Scotch whisky. We'll talk with CEO Susan Morrison on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
How about a really great 12-year-old Scotch whiskey? I have a stellar recommendation coming up for you in just a minute. Spoiler alert, it's Dewar's 12-year-old.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast, Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. The Distillers Charity and Sotheby's have unveiled the first tranche of lots for this year's Distillers One-of-One auction. The auction features one-of-a-kind Scotch whiskies and experiences, with pre-auction estimates ranging from £5,000 to more than £500,000. The auction will take place October 5th at Hopetoun House near Edinburgh. Proceeds go to the Distillers Charity Youth Action Fund, which supports youth across Scotland. The Scotch Whisky Association has published its new Water Stewardship Framework. It's a blueprint for distillers to improve their water efficiency. The industry has improved its water efficiency by 22% since 2012. But there's a target in place to reduce water usage. The target is between 12.5 and 25 liters of water per liter of alcohol produced, depending on the size of a distillery. Bruichladdich has unveiled a new bottle for its Classic Laddie Islay single malt. The bottle was designed with sustainability in mind, using 60% recycled glass, and is 32% lighter than the previous bottle. The move comes as Bruichladdich also stops producing a secondary tin for the Classic Laddie. That move alone is expected to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 65% each year. We have an update now on a story we first brought you last February in episode 990 during our interview with Jack McGarry of the Dead Rabbit Pub in New York City. He told us back then about plans to open a Dead Rabbit Pub in Austin, Texas. This week, the Dead Rabbit announced on its Instagram feed that all the permits have been secured from local officials and construction is now underway on the pub. No word yet on when it will open. During that interview, Jack also hinted at other expansion opportunities and announced one of them this week as well. This fall, the Dead Rabbit team will be opening the Irish Exit Pub in New York City's Moynihan Train Hall at Penn Station. It's the first of what will be several pubs located in airports and train stations around the country. The first distillery in Inverness in 40 years filled its first casks this week. Juliuvesh Distillery filled a batch of ex-bourbon and sherry casks for maturation, along with bottling new-make spirit to be sold to distillery visitors. The last distillery in Inverness was Millburn, which closed in 1985. New whiskies to mention this week. Loch Lomond is the official Scotch whisky of the Open Championship, which gets underway this week at Royal Liverpool Golf Club. This year there are two special bottlings for the tournament. The Open Special Edition 2023 is a Rioja finished single malt, while the Open Course Edition 2023 honors Royal Liverpool with a 22-year-old single malt distilled in 2000 and matured in organic American oak casks. That one sells for £239.95 a bottle, while the Open Special Edition sells for £47.95 a bottle. Ben Romick has added two new whiskies to its Contrasts series, and they explore the differences in oak drying. The Contrasts air-dried oak and kiln-dried oak were both distilled back in 2012. The air-dried oak edition was made from barrels with staves aged for 3 years before toasting. The kiln-dried oak comes from staves that were air-dried for 2 years, then put in a kiln to speed up the drying process. Both are bottled at 46% ABV. There's no word on pricing. Waterford Distillery held its Growers Gathering Festival a couple of weeks ago and is now making the festival bottling available for sale online. It's Waterford's first organic single-farm origin whiskey, with the grain coming from the Booth family's Killoan farm in County Loss. It's available through the Waterford website for £100 a bottle. In Kentucky, Log Still Distillery is releasing the second in its 5th district series that honors historic Kentucky distilleries. It's an 8-year-old high rye bourbon finished in toasted barrels and will be available in the coming weeks in Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina for $99.99 a bottle. And Delaware's Dogfish Head Brewing and Distilling has released the latest batch of its Let's Get Lost American single malt. It's made from 4 different types of malted barley and aged for more than 3 years. It's available in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. There's no word on pricing. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskeycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
I wanted to take just a minute to tell you what we've been working on behind the scenes. In addition to the new WhiskyCast community app, we've been working on a complete refresh of the WhiskyCast website. We've solved the problems many of you have experienced with searching the tasting notes and the calendar section, as well as simplifying the entire site to make it easier to use. I'd love to get your feedback on the new website. Check it out this week at whiskeycast.com. Time now for our look at the calendar of upcoming whiskey events around the world. The calendar is brought to you by Writer's Tears. Tickets are still available for Wednesday's Bourbon and Broadway dinner at Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville, Kentucky. Belfast Whiskey Week gets underway on Friday and runs through July 29th. Whiskey Live Sydney is this Friday and Saturday in Sydney, Australia. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society has a series of book signings and tastings with Dave Broom coming up next week in Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. And the Twisted Tale in Philadelphia celebrates National Scotch Whisky Day on the 27th with a Lafroig tasting. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at whiskeycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The calendar is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlach and the Classic Malts lineup. 35 years ago, Scotch whisky makers joined forces to create the Scotch Whisky Heritage Centre on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. It has since been renamed the Scotch Whisky Experience and drew in 337,000 tourists last year. This week, the Experience debuts a new tour that replaces the old barrel ride that taught guests about whiskey production. The high-tech experience has been in the works for several years, and CEO Susan Morrison says, like many things, it was delayed by the pandemic.
It started pre-COVID and we were working on it and it was all very exciting, and we had appointed a designer and we had a general kind of scope of works and a design, and then obviously all of a sudden it had to stop. So however, I'm delighted that we survived COVID. Our visitor numbers are pretty much back to 2019 levels. So we got working on it again, probably the best part of a year and a half ago. We started working on it again and getting it ready for site. So it kicked off on site in January. And we've been working with a temporary tour, well, a shortened tour in essence. Visitors are still experiencing the other areas we've got here in January, and we are just about ready to launch. I would think by week commencing 17th of July, we will be opening to our first visitors. So we're currently training the staff, and actually it's a nice place to be at, because I think my ops director and I, Angela, who've been really involved with it all the way along, you almost start to get, I don't know, a bit tired of it and thinking, is it as good as we think it is? Or, but once the guides got in and started to see it and I could see their excitement, it kind of all came flooding back, our original excitement about it. So yeah, we're at a really good point, and the guides are loving it and they are really good at delivering it. So we're just about there.
Tell me what the new tour entails.
Okay, so we had a barrel race that talked about production prior to this. It took about 10 minutes. And so whatever we put in there had to deliver production in a new and exciting way. So we now have 3 areas. The first area is, we've called it Origins. And Origins is really setting the scene for our visitors. It transports you to a Highland Glen, to kind of daybreak, and the day continues as visitors are just waiting and assembling for their tour to begin. A stag appears, there's a bird of prey goes over, the weather starts to get a bit Scottish and a bit rainy, and the thunder crowds come in, and then the guide kind of hits the show, big lightning and thunder crash, and the guide welcomes everybody and talks about really the water and the barley, our 2 big ingredients in whiskey, and a bit about the landscape. At that point. And then we move on quite quickly through into what we've called the art of whiskey making. And the guide introduces our spirit guide here. And the spirit guide, along with the help of a huge LED screen and an amazing AV, and these motorized kinetic balls, or spheres, as I'm being told to call them, motorized spheres, deliver basically how whiskey's made, from malting right through to the spirit safe. So right through to finishing distillation. And the spirit guide then hands back to our own live guide. And our live guide then takes visitors through into an enormous barrel. So you are inside a whiskey barrel. And we're talking about what happens inside the cask during maturation. So the cask is fired. You see it all charred around you, and the guide talks about how it will help the cask yield more flavour, rejuvenate over older casks. And then the cask starts to fill up with a new spirit. So it fills up around you. And we're talking about how it's drawing additional flavour and colour from the wood at that point. So the spirit changes colour so that visitors can see what's happening. And then we talk about, obviously, the bonded warehouse and the casks lying under lock and key and the angel's share, before we finish off that section, and we're ready to take them upstairs to continue the tour through the 5 whiskey making regions of Scotland, and where they get to see some spectacular Scottish scenery, along with hearing about the different flavours that you can get from single malts. And then obviously the tour continues as it was. So it's really 3 new areas we've added in order to deliver production to visitors.
What went into creating all this?
A lot of blood, sweat and tears. It's been such a long journey. I mean, obviously the original concept that came from our designer Craig Hatto, and then a lot of discussion about how we delivered that concept. We worked with a German company called Hüttinger, who are the manufacturers of these kinetic spheres. So we worked with them on how they could integrate with AV to provide quite a beautiful description. So it's quite a sculptural. I think to bear in mind, Mark, that our audience are novices. 80% are international. At last survey, 79% of our visitors said they knew little or nothing about whiskey. So our job for the industry is to take these people in and ignite that spark so that they're going to go further. They're going to maybe visit a distillery, or they're going to start talking about whiskey or buying whiskey. It's all about igniting that spark in visitors. So whatever we do has to be entertaining as well as informative. And often one of my most annoying jobs is reining our guides in, because unless they're on one of our specialist tours, we can't tell visitors too much or it's boring. So in order to ignite visitors' interest in whiskey, you've got to keep it reasonably digestible, and you've got to deliver it in quite an entertaining way. In order to make sure that that's the start of their whiskey journey, that they're going to then go and visit a distillery, go and do a tutor tasting, go and do something that's far more in depth. But so it is quite a show. Along with Hootinger, we were working with Creative Technologies. They're a big company from London. So that was really interesting, seeing how the designer, the AV producers, the media guys, the manufacturers of the motorised balls and SWE, we managed to work together to get this all to work, to deliver a true story about whiskey, but an entertaining story, and within certain times, so that we're not we needed it to fit into certain time so that it then hooks into the rest of the tour and doesn't slow. You don't start getting tours backing up in each other. So it's very complicated putting something like this together. And then you've got all the building side of it, the contractors and the health and safety and the fire and all these other things that you've got to make sure you've got nailed as well. So yeah, it's been a complex and complicated process, but I am delighted that we're coming to the end of it now, and the visitors are going to be able to experience it.
Has visitor traffic returned to pre-COVID levels?
Yes, it has. It took a while, right up until June last year. So June 22, we were still trading at about 40 to 50% our normal numbers. But from June last year onwards, numbers have gone up and up and up, and we're now back to 2019 levels, which is brilliant. And probably a good point to make is, on top of us being back to 2019 numbers, more visitors are trading up, and they're doing our gold tour rather than just the standard tour, the silver tour. So the gold tour is the experience, the silver tour, but at the end of it, they then do a bit of a tutor tasting. So people are trading up to do something slightly more complicated, which is really nice.
How is visitor traffic along the Royal Mile?
Back to normal at this time of year. So very challenging as a local to get from the top to the bottom of the Royal Mile with any speed. But it's nice to see visitors back and to hear all these international languages and cultures and voices on the mile.
Explain for those who have not been to the experience what the purpose is, because this is really sort of the industry's attempt to draw people into Scotch whisky, right?
Absolutely. So the reason we were set up 35 years ago by the Scotch whisky industry was because it was really challenging to get any visitor to Scotland to an actual distillery. And at the time, really only one or two distilleries had visitor facilities. So it was just going to be a tour around the distillery. And obviously there were lots of health and safety issues with that. So it was really to give people the opportunity to learn about Scotland's national drink when they were in Scotland. And back then, only 20% of visitors went further north than Stirling. So they didn't really have an opportunity to visit a distillery. That's all changed now, which is great. And we're busier than ever. But our job is still to bring in novices, so international visitors mainly, and domestic visitors who've got whiskey on their tick list. And most of them do, because whiskey's synonymous with Scotland. So when you get visitors to Scotland, on their list is Scotch whisky. And whether that's just going into a bar and trying a whisky with a barman, whether that's coming to us, and experiencing an entertaining, digestible description of how whiskey's made and how it's blended and a bit about the history, or whether it's jumping straight into a distillery now that are much easier to get to because we've now got Holyrood Distillery in Edinburgh. We're soon to have Port of Leith. We've now got the Johnnie Walker Experience, which is another kind of digestible way of learning about whiskey. So there's lots of options for them now, but our remit remains the same, to really just ignite that spark in people so they want to know more.
Thanks to Susan Morrison for spending some time with us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We have a link to the Scotch Whisky Experience's website in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the newest release from Old Pulteney. The Pinot de Charente finish is the debut release in Old Pulteney's Coastal series. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is fruity with peaches, red apples, and a hint of apricots. The taste is fruity and sweet with cooked fruits, raspberry jam, and a hint of wood spices, while the finish is long and spicy with underlying fruity notes. I'm scoring the Old Pulteney Pinot de Charente finish a 92. Next up, it's not quite Christmas in July yet, but the very old St. Nick Immaculata bourbon makes an appropriate selection. It's bottled by the folks at Preservation Distillery in Kentucky, with bourbons up to 15 years old in the blend, and it's bottled at 59% ABV. The nose has touches of subtle spices, stone fruits, and molasses. The taste has notes of cinnamon and allspice balanced by peaches, apricots, molasses, and a hint of maple syrup. The finish is long and subtle with a hint of maple syrup, and I'm scoring the very old St. Nick Immaculata bourbon an 89. Now let's look at the new Keeper's Heart Cask Strength whiskey. This blend of Irish whiskies and bourbon is bottled at 59% ABV. The nose has touches of caramel, red apple, butterscotch, and subtle spices. The taste has baking spices, caramel candy, red apples, honey, and butterscotch notes. The finish is long and dry with lingering spices, and I'm scoring the Keeper's Heart Cask Strength a 92. Finally, the folks at Lost Lantern have declared this the Summer of Bourbon, and one of their 8 summer releases is the Far Flung Bourbon. It's a blend of bourbons from distilleries in Texas, Ohio, Nevada, and Colorado. It's bottled at a whopping 68.4% ABV, and the nose has touches of wood spices, dried fruits, caramel, and a hint of tobacco. The taste is thick, chewy, and peppery with black pepper and chili powder notes that fade slowly to reveal dried fruits, tobacco, and honey. The finish, long and thick with lingering spices. I'm scoring the Lost Lantern Far Flung Bourbon a 92. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,500 whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at the all-new whiskeycast.com.
Gabriel here. The new Dewar's 12-year-old has been completely remastered to be richer, smoother, and more balanced. It's a total winner. It's double-aged in first fill premium bourbon casks for greater depth and breadth of flavor, with notes of apples, lemon zest, and spicy and floral notes with a long, smooth vanilla finish. The experts agree too. It's winning awards like pros sink putts. In fact, WhiskyCast's own Mark Gillespie gave it a 94-point rating, which is pretty amazing for a 12-year-old Scotch. It's also earned a 94-point rating from Whiskey Advocate. That makes it their highest-rated 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. It's an excellent testament to the skill, craft, and refinement of the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. Drink responsibly. Copyright 2023 Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume.
Let's check the WhiskyCast community app for some of this week's conversation. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey. Our friend Tyrone Cote posted a great poll this week. With inflation driving up the price of whiskey along with everything else these days, do you plan to buy more or less whiskey this year? 41% of those who answered the poll in the app said they'd be purchasing about the same amount. 35% said less, and only 24% said more. We reposted the poll on Twitter to get a bigger sample size, and the results were about the same, with fewer people planning to buy more whiskey. Some of the comments now. In the community app, the Tracer Bullet replied, "As prices keep rising, I have started to cut my purchases, and I'm also reducing purchases of the higher-priced bottles." And Elias Aoud added this comment, "I'm buying less. As my collection has grown, I've become more selective about what I buy. Increasing prices have also made blind buys less likely, so I've been passing on bottles that I would have taken a gamble on in the past when prices were lower across the board." Interestingly, on Twitter, the responses took a different tack, where people are planning to buy less because they already have a lot of whiskey on hand. At Demi Tastes Whiskey tweeted this, "My answer in the negative is an aspirational less because I have too much already, and I've found a few niches to focus on, rather than the try almost everything mentality over the last few years." Now, the Associated Press did a story the other day on county governments upset in Kentucky over the loss of barrel tax revenue. We did a segment on that back in May, and Matt listened to it the other day while he was catching up on podcast episodes. He posted this comment in the WhiskyCast community app. "Mark, great episode. Full disclosure, I am a Canadian and we certainly pay our fair share of taxes. I'd have to say, I can't say I'm not even a little surprised that there are now some counties pausing to consider the outcome of new distilleries if there is less revenue to be made. My prediction is that we may begin to see this more and more. We all love our bourbon, but I can't blame individual counties for considering their futures." Thank you for the comments, Matt, and to everyone who posted in the WhiskyCast community app this week. If you'd like to join the conversation, download the app from the Apple or Google App Stores. You can also find it at the all-new whiskeycast.com. Of course, you can also find me on Threads, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskeycast.com. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey, where they explore the frontiers of natural flavor one farm at a time to create unique Irish whiskies. Visit them on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history and science that makes whiskey unique. You may have heard me mention wood spices in my tasting notes for various whiskeys, like I did a few minutes ago. But just what are wood spices? Well, the obvious answer is that they're spices imparted to the whiskey from the wood it's being matured in. But let's go past the obvious for a moment. There are two types of maturation, additive and subtractive, and wood spices fall into the additive category. They're created by the interaction of wood and whiskey, while subtractive maturation uses elements like the charred layer of the wood to remove unwanted flavors from a whiskey. Vanilla is one of the wood spices that comes from the vanillin oils in a wood, but you can also get cinnamon, nutmeg, and peppery notes depending on the type of wood you're maturing a whiskey in. For instance, the recent craze around Japanese Mizunara oak has given us some whiskeys with sandalwood and coconut notes that come from the wood, along with other spices. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us on social media or in the WhiskyCast community app. That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes, going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Threads, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the new WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the Apple and Google App Stores. Our email address is comments@whiskeycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Find the new Dewar's 12-year-old and discover what all the awards are about. You can toast and thank me later. From Dewar's, the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.